Claire Morgan stood on the edge of a boat in Gabon, staring at the towering figure that emerged from the jungle. The massive silverback gorilla, known as Samson, locked his eyes onto hers and stepped forward with deliberate force. Guides shouted behind her, but Claire couldn't hear them over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Then it happened. Samson lunged forward, his powerful hand wrapping around her arm in a grip that could crush bone. The world seemed to freeze. The jungle hushed, the river held still, and even the birds stopped calling. Her father Richard stood paralyzed, knowing that any movement could trigger disaster. Every muscle in Samson's body radiated power, every movement filled with danger. But then, instead of tearing her away, he leaned closer, lowering his massive head toward hers in an act no one expected. The air was heavy with fear as Samson tightened his hold. His dark eyes scanned Claire's face as though searching for something hidden deep within her. The guides on the riverbank gripped their machetes, torn between stepping in or staying back. They knew one swipe from a silverback could end a life instantly. Claire's knees trembled beneath her, her arm aching beneath his crushing weight. And yet, in that terrifying moment, she noticed something familiar, something human in his gaze. It wasn't rage, it wasn't violence, it was recognition. Slowly, carefully, Samson shifted his posture, pulling Claire closer until their foreheads touched. The guides gasped, their fear giving way to disbelief. What should have been a moment of tragedy became one of reunion. The gorilla everyone believed had become untamed and wild remembered her, even after decades apart.
Claire's body shook with adrenaline, caught between terror and hope. She stared into the deep brown eyes of the massive gorilla. They weren't wild with fury, nor filled with hunger or threat. Instead, there was a softness, a searching presence that seemed to cut through the years and distance that had once separated them. The river guides could hardly believe what they were seeing. A creature of untamed wilderness, capable of immense destruction, was choosing something else entirely. Instead of tearing her away, Samson rested his head gently against her chest, a gesture of intimacy no one expected. The jungle, tense and watching, seemed to exhale in that instant. Richard's heart pounded as he realized what this meant. This was not the behavior of a stranger. It was the echo of a bond forged long ago, when Claire was only a child and Samson was just a fragile infant. For the guides, this was impossible. Gorillas raised in captivity and returned to the wild were never supposed to remember humans, not like this, not with such unmistakable tenderness. But Claire knew the truth. She had lived it. She had carried Samson as a baby, fed him when he was too weak to feed himself, and comforted him when nightmares left him trembling. This moment wasn't a miracle. It was the return of something that had never been lost. Still, to the onlookers, it was beyond comprehension. A silverback gorilla, with the strength to kill, was choosing instead to embrace. The questions flooded their minds. How was this bond possible? How could an animal raised for freedom in Africa still recognize the girl who had once called him family? To understand, we must journey back, to the time before the separation, to the place where it all began.
Claire Morgan's earliest memories weren't like other children's. While most grew up with playgrounds and bicycles, she spent her childhood inside the Morgan Wildlife Foundation, a zoo and sanctuary her father Richard had built from the ground up. Their mission was unlike any other, to rescue animals from poachers, heal them from wounds both visible and unseen, and whenever possible, return them to the wild. From lions to lemurs, the sanctuary was filled with creatures who needed saving, but none captured the family's heart more than the gorillas. Claire was barely out of diapers when she first found herself face to face with one. Where others saw danger, she saw family. While other children were tucked into cribs, Claire learned to press her hand against glass enclosures, forming silent friendships with creatures others only watched from afar. This unusual beginning would shape every moment of her extraordinary life. When Claire was just learning to walk, tragedy brought the first gorilla into her world. A young male, later named Leo, arrived at the sanctuary wounded and alone. Poachers had slaughtered his family, leaving him orphaned, with little chance of survival. Richard and his team nursed the frightened animal back to health, but it was Claire who bridged the gap between fear and trust. Barely steady on her feet, she would toddle near the enclosure, pressing small hands against the bars. Over time, Leo responded, mirroring her actions with surprising gentleness. For Claire, it wasn't unusual. She didn't see him as a dangerous animal. He was a playmate, a companion who needed her as much as she needed him. That fragile beginning between a little girl and an orphaned gorilla marked the start of a connection far stronger than anyone could have imagined.
Years later, the sanctuary received another call for help. A newborn gorilla had been discovered after his mother was killed, too young to survive alone. His name would become Samson. Unlike Leo, he arrived fragile and helpless, with wide, fearful eyes and a body so small that survival was uncertain. Richard carried him into the Morgan home, but it was Claire who became his constant companion. She fed him bottles late into the night, held him close when storms rattled the windows, and rocked him to sleep in her arms. Though Samson was not her brother by blood, he filled that role in every sense. As days turned to months, their bond deepened. Claire was his world, and he was hers. What no one knew then was that this unusual bond would become the foundation for a story spanning decades. Samson grew quickly, stronger with every passing week. Soon he joined Leo, and the two gorillas formed a bond as powerful as brothers. While other children argued over toys, Claire found herself surrounded by two playmates unlike any others. Together, they formed a trio, two gorillas and a little girl, each dependent on the other for comfort and joy. To outsiders, it was an impossible picture. To Claire, it was life itself. When she laughed, they rumbled with happiness. When she fell, they hovered protectively. They were her guardians, her companions, her siblings. And even as Samson's strength grew, his gentleness never faltered. He treated her not as prey, but as family. What had begun as tragedy for two orphaned gorillas was transformed into something miraculous. A family, stitched together not by blood, but by love and shared survival.
Claire's childhood became something out of legend. While other children spent afternoons riding bikes or swinging on playground sets, she walked straight into the gorilla enclosure after school. There, Samson and Leo greeted her like a long-lost friend. They tumbled beside her, rolled playfully in the grass, and embraced her with arms capable of breaking tree trunks, yet always with delicate restraint. The keepers watched in awe, seeing something scientists rarely acknowledged, a bond deeper than instinct, more powerful than fear. Claire was not a visitor in their world, she was family. The gorillas accepted her as one of their own. What amazed onlookers most was their gentleness. With her, there was no threat, no aggression, only affection. But such closeness could not remain hidden forever. One day, outsiders would see, and the reaction would not be wonder, but something far more dangerous. The day came when a photography crew visited the sanctuary, cameras in hand, eager to capture the unusual life unfolding within the Morgan Wildlife Foundation. What they witnessed stunned them. A young girl playing fearlessly with two powerful gorillas who returned her affection as though she was kin. They snapped pictures, believing the world would celebrate such rare harmony. Instead, the reaction was fury. When the photo spread, the public saw not love, but danger. Headlines accused Richard of recklessness, claiming he endangered his daughter's life by allowing her into the enclosure. Critics demanded change. Officials threatened closure of the sanctuary if rules were not enforced. What had once been Claire's happiest place was suddenly under attack. And soon, the childhood she treasured, days filled with laughter beside Samson and Leo, would be ripped away by forces she could not control.
The ruling was swift and unforgiving.
Claire was forbidden from entering the enclosure again. The days of rolling in the grass with Samson and Leo were over. In their place stood glass barriers, cold, sterile walls separating her from the brothers she had raised. Every day after school, Claire rushed to the sanctuary, pressing her hands against the glass. On the other side, Samson and Leo rushed to meet her, their giant palms matching hers, their low moans filled with longing. They couldn't understand why the rules had changed, why the girl who once laughed with them now sat outside, unreachable. The keepers explained it was for safety, but to Claire it felt like punishment, and to the gorillas it felt like loss. Their bond, though unbroken, was tested in ways none of them had ever known before. Though heartbreaking, the separation served another purpose. Richard and his team had always intended for the gorillas to return to their true home, the wild forests of Africa. To survive there, Samson and Leo would need to learn independence, strength, and the instincts of their kind. Slowly, the keepers reduced human interaction, giving the gorillas space to bond with each other and grow into leaders of their future troop. For Claire, this meant even fewer moments with her companions. She watched from a distance as trainers taught them how to forage, climb, and defend themselves. Every step brought them closer to freedom and further from her. Deep down, Claire knew this was right. The sanctuary had always been about saving, not keeping. Still, the thought of saying goodbye tore at her heart, a wound that would never truly heal. The day came faster than Claire imagined. Samson and Leo were ready for release. Before their journey began, Claire was allowed one final visit. As soon as she entered, the gorillas rushed to her, wrapping her in embraces that felt both joyful and sorrowful. Samson pressed his head against hers, just as he had since he was a baby. Leo rumbled softly, nuzzling close, reluctant to let go. Claire clung to them with everything she had, knowing this might be the last time she would ever feel their warmth. Sedatives were prepared, crates lined up for transport. The keepers urged her to step back, but she lingered, unwilling to release them. Tears filled her eyes as the gorillas were guided away, their heavy bodies succumbing to the medicine. Her childhood family was leaving, and she feared they might never return. The next morning, Claire watched in silence as Samson and Leo were lifted into transport crates and loaded onto trucks. Their journey would take them across the ocean, to the lush forests of Gabon, where they would join a sanctuary designed to give them freedom. For the Morgan family, this was victory, proof that their mission to rescue and rehabilitate was working. For Claire, it was heartbreak. She pressed her hands against the wooden crates, whispering silent goodbyes as the doors slammed shut. Hours later, the gorillas were gone, carried to another continent, another life. The house felt empty without them. The enclosure that once rang with laughter now echoed with silence. Claire knew this was what her father had always wanted, for the gorillas to live wild and free. But knowing didn't make the loss any easier. Time passed, and reports trickled in from Gabon. Samson and Leo had not only survived, they had thrived. They joined a wild troop, learning the ways of the forest, carving out lives as true gorillas. By all accounts, they had become untouchable, untamed, and fully free. For the world, this was success. For Claire, it was bittersweet. She dreamed of them often, replaying memories of their playful youth, the warmth of their touch, the sound of their low rumbles. Yet every expert warned her never to return. Gorillas raised in captivity could become dangerous when rewilded. They wouldn't remember her, and worse, they could harm her. But fate has a way of rewriting the rules. Claire's story with Samson and Leo wasn't finished. A new chapter was waiting, one that would test every warning she had ever heard. Years turned into decades, and Claire devoted her life to the foundation, rescuing animals and continuing her father's mission. But one day, everything changed. Richard fell gravely ill, his health faltering in ways that forced him to reconsider his time left. After a slow recovery, he confided in Claire his deepest wish, to see Gabon once more and to witness the sanctuary where Samson and Leo had been released. For Richard, it was closure, a chance to see the fruits of his life's work. For Claire, it was an opportunity she had longed for since childhood. Yet beneath the excitement was fear. Could she face the gorillas again? And if she did, would they remember her or treat her as a stranger in their world? The choice loomed before her, one that would shape the course of her life forever.
When Richard revealed his plan, Claire didn't hesitate. She refused to let him make the long journey alone, especially with his health still fragile. But her reasons went deeper. This was her chance to see Samson and Leo again, to discover whether the bond of family had survived across continents and years. The warnings returned immediately. Experts reminded her that the gorillas were wild now, no longer the affectionate companions she once knew. If she went, they said, she risked everything: her safety, her memories, her heart. But Claire's decision was final. She would go, no matter the cost. For her, the chance of reunion was worth any risk. Richard understood, even if others didn't. Together, father and daughter prepared for a journey that would lead them back to the jungles of Gabon, and back to the gorillas who had defined their lives. As preparations continued, doubts crept in. Friends warned Claire of disappointment. What if Samson and Leo didn't remember her? What if they rejected her, or worse, attacked her? They insisted she was chasing a fantasy, clinging to memories that no longer existed. The gorillas had moved on. Claire risked replacing cherished moments with scars that would last forever. These warnings played in her mind as she packed her bags, weighing every fear against her unshakable hope. But something inside her refused to surrender. She couldn't believe that love could vanish so easily. Deep in her heart, she knew the gorillas still carried a piece of her, just as she carried them. The question was whether she would find it, or whether the wild would prove everyone else right. This was no ordinary trip. It was a gamble with memory itself. The road to Gabon was not easy. First came the long flight across the Atlantic, followed by a jarring ride in off-road vehicles that rattled across dirt paths carved through dense jungle. Finally, the Morgans reached a base camp where guides would lead them further. There were no roads to the sanctuary, no airports nearby. The last stretch could only be made by boat, gliding along winding rivers that cut through the untouched wilderness. Claire breathed in the thick, humid air, alive with the sounds of insects and distant cries of unseen animals. Every step forward brought them closer to the gorillas, but also deeper into a land that belonged not to humans, but to the wild. It was a place of beauty and danger, where survival was never guaranteed, and where the past and present were about to collide. At the base camp, the head guide, Mark, gathered the Morgans for a stern briefing. His words carried weight, born of experience. The gorillas, he explained, were wild now, untouched by humans for nearly 2 decades. They were unpredictable, capable of aggression, and protective of their families. Approaching them without permission could mean disaster. Claire and Richard were instructed to remain still, to avoid sudden movements, and above all, never attempt to touch them. If the gorillas charged, they were to retreat without hesitation. For Mark, this was a matter of survival. For Claire, it was a test of restraint. She nodded, but inside, doubt churned. If Samson appeared, could she really stand still? Could she watch him pass as though they were strangers? The warnings were clear, but her heart told her something else entirely.
As the briefing ended, Claire's mind replayed the warnings. Do not approach, do not touch. But what if she couldn't resist? What if Samson appeared before her eyes, the gorilla she had once fed, cradled, and called family? Could she remain motionless, as though he was nothing more than a shadow of memory?
The thought tormented her as night fell over the camp. Sleep offered no peace, only dreams of gorillas pressing their heads against hers, only to vanish into the jungle mist. She awoke with resolve stronger than fear. If she saw Samson, she wouldn't hesitate. She would let her heart decide, no matter what the experts said. It was a reckless promise, but one she knew she couldn't break. The jungle was calling, and her past was waiting. The risk was immense, the reward immeasurable. The next morning, the Morgans boarded a small boat and pushed into the winding river. The jungle loomed overhead, its canopy thick and suffocating, its shadows alive with unseen movement. Hours passed as the boat glided silently forward. Then, suddenly, Claire felt eyes on her. Shapes shifted in the trees. Dark faces peered from behind leaves, watching closely. The gorillas had found them. Her heart pounded as she scanned the forest. There, partially hidden by branches, was a massive figure unlike the rest. Broad shoulders, silvered fur, eyes sharp with recognition. Samson. She knew him instantly, despite the years, despite the distance. He was larger now, scarred by the wild, but still unmistakably him. For Claire, time seemed to collapse. The jungle held its breath, and destiny began to stir.
The forest grew silent as Samson emerged fully from the trees. He was larger than Claire had ever imagined, towering over her father and the guides, his chest broad, his steps deliberate. His gaze never wavered from Claire, as though no one else existed. Every instinct in the guides screamed danger. They shouted warnings, urging the Morgans to stay still, but their voices felt distant. Claire could only watch as Samson closed the distance, each stride carrying the weight of memory and mystery. Her pulse raced, torn between fear and longing. Could he possibly remember her, or was she just another human intruding on his world? As Samson drew near, the answer became terrifyingly clear. With one swift motion, his massive hand shot forward, wrapping around her arm in a grip no human could resist. The riverbank erupted in chaos. Guides shouted in panic, their hands clutching weapons they prayed they wouldn't need to use. Richard's chest tightened as he fought the instinct to intervene, knowing a single wrong move could doom them all. Claire's breath caught in her throat as Samson's grip tightened. The weight of his strength pressed into her bones, a reminder of just how fragile she was. The world slowed around her, the rustling leaves, the rushing river, even the beating of her own heart seemed to fade into silence. Every possibility flashed before her, pain, blood, and loss. And yet, amid the fear, she held on to hope. Hope that this wasn't an attack. Hope that this was something else entirely. The outcome balanced on a knife's edge, where love and danger collided in the wild.
Then, in an instant, the tension broke. Samson shifted, his grip softening. He lowered his head, pressing his brow gently against Claire's chest. The jungle seemed to sigh as the danger melted away, replaced by something far more powerful. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she reached up, stroking his head the way she had when he was a frightened infant. Decades vanished in that single gesture. She wasn't facing a stranger, she was holding her brother again. The guides stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't instinct or coincidence. This was memory. This was love. Samson remembered. And in that moment, the warnings of experts, the fears of strangers, all proved wrong. Against every expectation, the bond had survived. As Claire held Samson, another figure emerged from the shadows. Leo, older and gentler, approached with cautious steps. His eyes softened as they fell on Claire, and he reached out with a single finger, tracing it lightly along her cheek. It was a gesture of recognition, unmistakable and tender.
The years melted away as both gorillas surrounded her, no longer wild strangers but long-lost family. Richard watched with awe as his daughter stood between them, embraced not with violence, but with love. For the guides, this was unthinkable. For Claire, it was everything she had ever hoped for. The gorillas hadn't forgotten. They hadn't let go. Across oceans, across decades, the bond had endured. And now, in the heart of the wild, it had come back to life.
Richard stepped forward cautiously, his heart swelling with both fear and pride. He had raised these gorillas too, had carried them through nights of sickness and days of play. As he approached, the gorillas shifted, their attention suddenly turning toward him. For a brief, tense moment, the guides feared aggression. But then, just as quickly, Samson and Leo leapt toward Richard, not with anger, but with playful energy. They wrestled with him, rolling against his body, tugging at his arms like oversized children reunited with their father. Laughter bubbled up in Richard's chest, unexpected and overwhelming. The years of worry, the warnings, the doubts, all faded. The gorillas remembered him too. The family was whole again, even if only for a fleeting moment in time. The guides could hardly believe what they were seeing. Two wild gorillas, long thought untouchable, had abandoned every instinct to treat humans as strangers. Instead, they returned to love, to family, to memory. It was a reunion no scientist would have predicted, no expert would have dared to allow. The danger was still real, but in this moment, it was overshadowed by something stronger. Claire and Richard stood surrounded by gorillas who should have forgotten them, but hadn't. The question lingered in the minds of everyone watching. Was this just a reunion, or was it proof of something far greater? Proof that bonds, once forged, never truly die. The jungle, so often a place of survival and instinct, had revealed a truth more powerful than any warning.
The hours passed too quickly. As the sun dipped lower, the guides insisted it was time to leave. Reluctantly, Claire prepared to say goodbye once again. But Samson and Leo resisted. They clung to her, moaning softly, their massive arms wrapping around her in gentle but unyielding embrace. Leo hugged her with tenderness, his grip careful, his eyes filled with sorrow. Samson lowered his head once more against her chest, refusing to release her. Claire's tears flowed freely, soaking into their fur as she held them with every ounce of love left in her heart. The guides urged her back toward the boat, but her body refused to move. This was the farewell she had dreaded, the moment she never wanted to face again. And yet, even in the pain, there was beauty. They remembered. At last, Claire stepped onto the boat, her body trembling with emotion. Richard joined her, his face etched with both pride and sorrow. From the river, they looked back at the shore, where Samson and Leo stood, watching intently. The gorillas did not move, their eyes locked on Claire as though unwilling to let her go. As the boat drifted away, soft moans echoed through the jungle, carrying the weight of a love that distance could never erase. Claire pressed her hand to her heart, whispering silent words only they could understand. Against every warning, every prediction, every fear, she had proven the truth. Love outlives time. Family transcends distance. And even in the heart of the wild, the bond between a girl and her gorillas had endured. Forever unbroken, forever remembered.